Hello everyone, welcome to Cashcroft TV. My name is Kalen Ashcroft. Thank you very much for watching or listening to this episode of Ages of Empires, where we will be going through all the major world empires throughout history. In this episode we will be covering the French Colonial Empire and the Oyo Empire, two very quite different empires. However, I think that will make even a more exciting comparison. Furthermore, we will highlight a specific leader from each empire. So from the French Colonial Empire, we will be highlighting Louis XIV, or the Sun King. And from the Oyo Empire, we will be highlighting Alaafin Abiodun, or, well, that would be essentially King Abiodun. So two very pinnacles of their respective empires. So without further ado, we will begin with the first empire. So the French Colonial Empire, we will structure this in the rise and fall. So the rise and fall of the French Colonial Empire. So the French Colonial Empire, spanning several centuries, experienced various phases of expansion and contraction. And some even consider it to be two separate empires, the first French Colonial Empire and the second Colonial Empire, separated perhaps by the Napoleonic Empire, or the French Empire formerly called as well. However, they're often considered one overall enterprise, however, so we will consider it once, however, like that. So the history of the French, it encompassed vast territories from the Americas, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, at least in terms of number of countries that we've covered so far. It covers the most, so most modern countries today. That's the former territorial extent. Furthermore, the history of the French Colonial Empire can broadly be divided into two major phases, as alluded to. The first French Colonial Empire from the 16th to the 19th centuries, and the second French Colonial Empire from the 19th to the 20th centuries. So for some further background information before starting with the rise of this empire, so the French Colonial Empire, also known as the Empire Colonial Français, comprised of the overseas colonies, protectorates, and mandate territories that came under French rule from the 16th century onward. So that's important to note: the colonies, protectorates, and mandate territories. A distinction is generally made, as mentioned, between the French Colonial Empire that existed until 1814, by which time most had been lost or sold, and the second French Colonial Empire, a sort of re-emergence which began from the conquest of Algiers in 1830. On the eve of World War I, France's colonial empire was the second largest in the world after the British Empire. So actually this culminates in the sixth largest, at least during the second period, the sixth largest empire of all time. So very significant. Maybe also in parallel in our episode on the Portuguese Empire, there was the Portuguese Empire, but then for a period it was subdued, or not necessarily subdued, but it was united with the Spanish crown during the Iberian Union. So, but we combined the first Portuguese Empire and the second Portuguese Empire, as we've done with the first French Colonial Empire. Then there's the Napoleonic period, which we'll cover after, and now here, and as well we will also cover the second Colonial Empire in this episode. So, starting with the rise of the First Colonial Empire from the 16th to the early 19th centuries, CE Common Era. So, with the early beginnings in the 16th century. So, the First Colonial Empire began in the early 16th century, motivated by exploration, trade, and the spread of Christianity. So, those three-pronged influences. Trade, exploration, and the spread of Christianity drove the initial aspirations, and perhaps maybe why we can combine both the first and second colonial empires is those same manifested beliefs. So as for the first component, the explorations of Giovanni da Verrazzano in 1524 CE. So commissioned by King Francis I, Verrazzano, a great explorer, explored the North American coast from the Carolinas to Newfoundland. If one is familiar, the Carolinas are in modern-day United States, and Newfoundland is in modern-day Canada, claiming lands for France during this period. Followed by the very famous Jacques Cartier in 1534 to 1542. So Cartier's voyages led to the discovery and the exploration of the St. Lawrence River, a very famous river in Canada, laying the foundation for the French claims in Canada. That's still there's still a very large French influence in Canada till this day. As for early settlements during this first French colonial period, the Charlesbourg Royale in 1541 to 1543 CE, an early settlement attempt by Cartier failed due to harsh conditions and conflicts with indigenous peoples, but this would be considered the first real attempt at colonization during this period, the Charles Royal from 1541 to 1543. Furthermore, Port Royal began to be established in 1605, so by the establishment of Charles de Champlain, a very famous Canadian historical figure, in Acadia, which is in modern-day Nova Scotia. It marked the first successful French settlement in the North America. That's Port Royal. As for the expansion and consolidation under the 17th century, so France expanded its colonial reach significantly in the 17th century, establishing colonies in North America, the Caribbean, and Africa, and as well Asia. Starting with North America, so known as New France, so Champlain founded Quebec in 1608, which became the capital of New France. Montreal was established in 1642, and the fur trade flourished at this time, so there's that trade component driving the expansion of the French colonial empire, driven by alliances with indigenous tribes, so the fur trade was engaged in trade. Often the French, in some ways, negotiated perhaps better with the indigenous people because maybe they were focused on conversion to religion, for example, or just focused on trade, or maybe they came at a different period, and that was just the nature of how things would have developed. But nonetheless, that relationship was seen somewhat more positively. Indigenous tribes such as Huron and the Algonquin interacted with them during this period. As for Louisiana in modern-day United States, its state itself, the La Salle claimed the Mississippi River basin for France in 1682, naming it Louisiana, after the Louise, a vast territory extending from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes. As for the Caribbean, so Saint Dominique, Saint Domingue, that's a G, which is in modern-day Haiti, was established in 1664, and it became the wealthiest French colony due to its sugar plantations reliant on enslaved labor. So it was the richest colony, but perhaps maybe not the most ethical in modern standards. As for in Africa, Senegal was another key site in the French colonial empire. So French trading posts in Senegal from the 1650s focused on the trade of slaves, gold, and other goods. So although maybe the relationship with the indigenous people might have been more positive in terms of slavery, the slave trade, they were perhaps not necessarily the most moral in that regard. As for some of their key achievements in Asia during this period, starting with India, so the French East India Company, founded in 1664, established a trading post in Pondicherry and other parts of India, competing with the British East India Company, both quite parallelly named even. As for the apex and rivalry in the 18th century, so the 18th century saw the height of the first French colonial empire, but it also intense rivalries, particularly with Britain, another very important colonial empire. As for apex and rivalry, the culmination of this rivalry in North America, with their conflicts with Britain, so the struggle for conflict in North America culminated in the famous 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763, known in North America as the French and Indian War as well. As for Asia, there was conflicts there as well, with the conflict in India. French and British forces clashed over control in India, with the British ultimately gaining the upper hand. Furthermore, for decline and loss during this period, so in the mid-18th century, perhaps ending our first colonial empire, so the decline of the first colonial empire began with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, marking the end of the 7 Years' War. Further on this Treaty of Paris, which was once again in 1763, it resulted in the loss of Canada in many ways. France ceded Canada and its territories east of the Mississippi River to Britain, although still gaining some claim to it, but nonetheless the Treaty of Paris largely gave it put it under British control. As for Louisiana, France secretly transferred Louisiana to Spain to prevent British control as well, as we shall highlight to come. As for the Haitian Revolution, so the French Revolution, known as the Haitian Revolution in 1789, 9 led to the upheaval of the colonies in the Haiti, an important region for them. It once was their wealthiest colony. In 1791, this was the revolution, to 1804, resulting in the ultimate independence of Saint Domingue, leading to a severe blow to the French colonial interests, and particularly its economy. As for the end of the First French Empire, in the early 19th century, so the First French colonial empire effectively ended in the early 19th century. As for the Napoleonic Wars, so this intermediary period, which we will highlight in a specific episode, however, so started with the Louisiana Purchase, which came before, so to put a little bit of context, so in 1803, facing financial difficulties and unable to maintain control, Napoleon Bonaparte sold Louisiana to the United States, so in part he really influenced the decline of the First French colonial empire, some might say. As for loss of influence, so the Napoleonic Wars drained French resources, leading to further losses and weakened control over the remaining colonies. As for the Treaty of Paris in 1814 or 1815, it was ratified. The treaties that ended the Napoleonic Wars confirmed the loss of many French colonies, cementing the end of the First French colonial empire. As for the Second French colonial empire, however, a reemergence after the Napoleonic period, from 1830 to the 1960s, so getting quite modern in time, starting with its early expansion from 1830 to 1870. So the French colonial empire began in the 19th century, marked by renewed expansion in Africa and Asia. As for North Africa, it started with Algeria, so France invaded Algeria in 1830, leading to a prolonged and brutal colonization process, and lasted until 1962, so that's really maybe a defining feature of this Second Colonial Empire. It sort of reemerges as a colonial empire in Algeria, and it continues up until 1962, which is in some considered one of the ending periods of the Second Colonial Empire. As for Southeast Asia, such as Indochina, starting in 1850s, France gradually established control over Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, collectively known as French Indochina, so important regions that still have a French influence, or still a manifest of French influence. As for issues in the Pacific, Tahiti and New Caledonia were also important regions for the French colonial empire. France expanded into the Pacific, establishing colonies in Tahiti in 1842 and New Caledonia in 1853, so once again manifesting colonial spirit. Whereas the Napoleonic era was more focused on the continental Europe. As for the height of the empire, from the late 19th to the early 20th centuries, from the late 19th and early 20th centuries marked the zenith of the Second French colonial empire, and perhaps if we're uniting the two, the peak of the French colonial empires more broadly, and driven by competition with other European powers and the pursuit for economic and strategic interests. So perhaps it was driven to this zenith through external factors. As for the scramble of Africa, which is documented very well in Empires by Michael Doyle, a great professor, France expanded its presence in Africa, establishing colonies in West Africa, such as Senegal and the Ivory Coast, Central Africa, such as Gabon and Congo, and as well Madagascar, all countries that were important for producing wealth and prosperity for the Second French colonial empire, and still manifest French influences to this day. As for their influence in the Middle East at this time as well, starting with Syria and Lebanon. So following the World War I, at the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, France gained mandates over Syria and Lebanon, so still manifesting its colonial spirit, which it maybe perhaps does not do to this day anymore. As for economic exploitation, however, under this Second French colonial empire, so the colonies were exploited for their resources with investments in infrastructure aimed at extracting raw materials and facilitating trade, so sort of a parasitic nature. As for, however, challenges and decline that have started emerging in the 20th century, leading to our ultimate decline here. So the 20th century saw growing resistance to colonial rule and the eventual decline of the French colonial empire. Events such as World War II. The war weakened European colonial powers, including France, draining much of its resources and losing control over the regions that came under its power. The Vichy regime, in collaboration with Nazi Germany, led to a loss of control over some colonies as well, which were later regained by the French Free Forces. But however, some of perhaps hypothesis is that the spirit of sort of ending an empire might have it would have been hypocritical if France continued its colonial ambitions after the events of World War II. So as for post-war decolonization, so the end of World War II sparked independence movements across the colonies, perhaps manifested by a similar spirit, such as the Indo-China Wars from 1946 to 1954. The First Indo-China War ended with the Geneva Accord in 1954, leading to the independence of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. As for the Algerian War, from 1954 to 1962, which was one of its first and most important colonies. So the brutal Algerian War of Independence culminated in Algeria gaining independence in 1962, causing a significant blow to the French colonial ambitions and one of its key pieces. As for further African independence, throughout the 1950s and 1960s, numerous African colonies gained independence, often peacefully and through negotiations, perhaps through this changed spirit after World War II. So therefore, there's this internal factor, perhaps a cultural change, but also external factors as the economy was weakened, and therefore these states were allowed to fight for their independence if necessary, if they could not get it through negotiations to begin with. As for the end of the empire in the 1960s, by the 1960s, the French colonial empire had largely disintegrated, with most territories gaining independence. As for the French community following this, in effort to maintain influence, France established the French Community in 1958, offering a degree of autonomy to former colonies while retaining economic and military ties, maybe in some ways influencing the modern European Union model. Thus, or even setting a foundation to adopt the European Union model. As for the legacy of the French colonial empires, we can call it two perhaps, or one, however, spirit, for example, start from Algeria to end of Algeria, for example. The legacy of the French colonialism is evident in the widespread use of the French language in these regions, legal and educational systems, the civil law, for example, based off, for example, the Napoleonic Code, and cultural influences in former colonies. The Napoleonic Code, which the influences continued into the Second French Empire, colonial empire, pardon me. So thus, the rise and fall of the French colonial empire was marked by periods of significant expansion and intense rivalry with European powers, followed by a decline from wars of independence movements, and global shifts in power and perhaps culture as well. The legacy of the French colonial empire, first and second, continues to influence the political, cultural, and economic landscape of many former colonies. So very, very fascinating period of time. It would be books could be written, well, books have been, and many books should be written on both the First Colonial Empire and the Second Colonial Empire, but I think perhaps by combining it into one sort of spirit, maybe we even learn more through this exercise. So as to highlight a specific leader, so to highlight which leader, I thought, why not Louis XIV, the Sun King, who perhaps maybe really manifested the full spirit of the French Colonial Empire, both first and second, and perhaps one of the most powerful leaders of all time. So, Louis XIV, the Sun King, Roi de Soleil. I remember I had a class, a French class, and I thought it was Roi de Soleil, but it's Le Roi Soleil. It's the Sun King, not the King of the Sun. So, side note. So, as for also known as the architect of the French colonial empire. So, starting with his early life and background. So, Louis the 14th, also known as Louis the Great, or the Sun King, or Le Roi Soleil, was born on September 5th, 1638, at the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye, France. He was the son of Louis the 13th of the France and Louis the 14th of France and Anne of Austria. So he was half Austrian, perhaps, or certainly so. His birth was seen as a miracle because his parents had been married for 23 years without producing an heir, so sort of a miracle child that they were not expecting. So being married for 23 years and not bearing a child is would be quite a miracle, earning him the moniker Dieudonné, which means God-given. Dieudonné, literally. So, as for some background details, so Louis XIV, also known as Louis Dieudonné, born on the 5th of September 1638, and dying on the 1st of September 1715, just before his birthday, also known as Louis the Great, or Louis le Grand, Louis the Big, or the Sun King, Le Roi Soleil, was King of France from 1643 until his death in 1715 CE. His verified reign of 72 years and 110 days is the longest of any sovereign. That is quite a claim, so if anything, whatever can be said, he was at least the longest reigning sovereign. Although Louis XIV's France was emblematic of the age of absolutism, so an absolute monarchy for certain. He was even God considered, or God-given at least. In Europe, the king was surrounded himself with a variety of significant political, military, and cultural figures such as Bossuet, Colbert, Louvois, Lebrun, Le Notre, Lully, Mazarin, Molière, Racine, Turenne, Condé, and Vauban. So despite being such a powerful figure, there's many other individuals that are important to study as well, as many of whom we hope to highlight here. So, as for his ascension to the throne, so as for the Regency period, Louis XIV ascended to the throne on the 14th of May 1643, following the death of his father. At the time, he was only 4 years old, so he was basically, his rise to the throne was almost immediate. One is hardly conscious at 3, but hence, that's why he had the longest reign. At only 4 years old, his mother Anne of Austria served as regent, so acting as acting queen, but not he nonetheless holds the title, with Cardinal Mazarin acting as his chief minister. So a very important figure to study, because when he's 4 or 5, those influences are very, very powerful within the nation. As for the Fronde, during his youth, France was embroiled in a series of civil wars known as the Fronde, from 1648 to 1653, where nobility and parliaments rebelled against royal authority. These events profoundly impacted Louis and reinforcing his belief in strong centralized power. So coming up into the throne, which was necessarily his, seeing these sort of insurgencies within the nation, he believed that he needed to rule with a strong fist, it seems, or at least the Fronde was a significant influence. As for establishing an absolute monarchy with his personal rule, after Cardinal Mazarin's death in 1661, Louis XIV declared that he would rule without a chief minister, marking the beginning of a personal reign. So a very big shift to say to say one should not have a chief minister and rule. Is essentially, for example, the King of England were to get rid of the Prime Minister. He centralized power and asserted his absolute authority, famously stating, "L'état c'est moi," the state is mine, or I am the state, or "L'état c'est moi," I am the state, pardon me. As for the Palace of Versailles, one of the most famous sights of all time, Louis transformed the hunting lodge of Versailles into a magnificent tower, symbolizing his absolute power, also moving his capital away to outside of the center of Paris and the center of political life in France. Versailles became a tool for controlling the nobility, who were required to spend time there under the king's watchful eyes. They would come in like a large hotel where he'd have control over them, even physically and in terms of monitoring. As for colonial expansion, so manifesting the colonial spirit of the first colonial empire and second as well. So under Louis XIV's reign, the first French colonial empire saw significant expansion. His policies aimed to extend French influence globally, driving by economic interests, strategic considerations, and his desire to spread the Catholicism across, particularly, as we shall start with North America. So in New France, Louis XIV's reign saw the strengthening of French presence in Canada, with Quebec serving as the capital, so formulating Quebec as the capital of the French region, and now today Quebec still has a very, very significant French influence. Furthermore, explorers like René Robert Cavelier Sieur de La Salle, claiming vast territories in the Mississippi, and Sieur de La Salle, very famous French explorer as well, claiming vast territories in the Mississippi Valley, naming it Louisiana in honor of himself, Louis XIV. That's why it's called Louisiana till this day. As for Hudson Bay, French expeditions contested British influence in North America, including attempts to control the Hudson Bay area. As for his endeavors in the Caribbean, Saint Domingue, also known as modern-day Haiti, under Louis XIV, the French established control of the western part of the island of Hispaniola, developing into a prosperous territory in Saint Domingue, which became the world's leading sugar producer. So, hence, actually the richest territory within the French colonial empire, the first French colonial empire. As for his endeavors in Africa, with Senegal, the French expanded their presence in West Africa, establishing trading posts in Senegal, fostering the lucrative trade of slaves, gold, and other goods. As for his endeavors in India, such as Pondicherry, Louis XIV established the French East India Company in 1664, so it was he himself who established the famous French East India Company to compete against the British and Dutch India Companies. The company established several trading posts, including Pondicherry, which became the center of French influence in India, and this influence can still be seen there to this day. As for other territories, French expansion also included territories in the Indian Ocean and the establishment of trading posts and colonies in the Americas, including the Lesser Antilles. As for his military and administrative reforms, starting with the Navy, which was necessary given his naval ambitions, Louis XIV significantly expanded and modernized the French Navy, reorganizing its importance for protecting colonial interests and trade routes. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, his finance minister, also played a crucial role in these efforts, establishing new shipyards and increasing the number of warships. So necessarily had to have a good finance minister to make his naval expansion dreams come true. As for mercantilism, Colbert implemented mercantilist policies to make the French economy self-sufficient and maximize the benefits of colonial trade. So, very important figure, this Colbert, in terms of study of finance, and at least colonial finance. This included encouraging the production of goods in France and the colonies and established monopolies on certain trade. As for administration and centralization, Louis XIV streamlined colonial administration, establishing the Sovereign Council of New France to govern the colony and appointing intendants to enforce royal policies. So intendants, in a way of centralization, is to have intendants or individuals who are distributed throughout the empire to exert one's control. This centralization aimed to strengthen the control over distant colonies as well. As for challenges, however, and his legacy, starting with his conflicts and wars, so Louis XIV's reign was marked by numerous conflicts, including the War of Spanish Succession from 1701 to 1714, which strained French resources and impacted colonial ambitions. Despite these challenges, France emerged as a dominant European power with a vast colonial empire. As for his influence on cultural patronage, Louis XIV was a great patron of the arts, and his reign is often considered the pinnacle of French culture. He supported writers, artists, musicians, fostering a cultural renaissance that had lasting impacts both in France and the colonies. So very, very important figure in many respects, and many of the parts of even modern French identity were defined during this period. As for his legacy, Louis XIV died on September 1st, 1715, after a 72-year reign, the longest of any major European monarch. His legacy in colonial expansion is complex, marked by significant achievements in extending French influence worldwide, but also by the costs of constant warfare and the burden of an absolute monarchy and colonial ambitions further. So thus, Louis XIV was the most important ruler of the French colonial empire, or at least the most powerful at least, overseeing significant expansion and consolidation of the French territories overseas. His policies and vision for a centralized, powerful state not only strengthened French domestically, but also laid the foundation for the global empire that would influence history for centuries. So the Second French Empire was in many ways influenced by his aspirations and plans with navy, etc. His reign left, therefore, an indelible mark on France and its colonies, shaping their development and legacy. So that is, in my opinion, the very fascinating Louis XIV and the French colonial empire, as to discuss the content of the slide. So the title, we have is Louis XIV and the French colonial empire, also known as the first French and second colonial empires. It was overseas colonies, protectorates, and mandate territories under French rule from the 16th century onward. The significant leader we highlighted was Louis XIV, or Le Roi Soleil, the Sun King. The empire was the French colonial empire from the period of 1534 to 1980 CE, so a very, very large period. However, there's the Napoleonic period in between, which also culminated or manifested a period of decline within. The modern locations include, this is a record number of at least distinct countries, but not necessarily only the number 6th of all time in terms of geography, but in terms of number of countries, one of the most. So modern locations include France, Canada, the United States, India, Algeria, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Sudan, Mali, Niger, Chad, Madagascar, Mauritania, Central African Republic, Somali, South Sudan, Ivory Coast, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Madagascar, Senegal, Guinea, Benin, Burundi, Rwanda, Tunisia, Syria, Vietnam, Madagascar, Mali, Cambodia, Laos, Lebanon, Morocco, Senegal, Togo, Guinea-Bissau, Djibouti, Vanuatu, Comoros, Gabon, Republic of Congo, Luxembourg, Gambia, and Mauritius. So a very, very large number of countries. So in terms of million square kilometers, so the peak under the first French colonial empire was 3.4 million square kilometers and 11.5 under the second French colonial empire. So the second was larger, however, in many ways built upon the spirit of the first, and nonetheless that would be the 6th largest of all the largest empires we've covered of all time. The equivalent of million square kilometers would be 1.31, which would be the first, and 4.44, the second. And percent of the world would be 2.52%, it would be the first, and 8.53 would be the second. So that's excluding Antarctica, a very massive region, but always we must caveat that some regions of the world are easier than other areas of the world. So perhaps at least from their perspective, perhaps it was maybe some of the regions they were ruling over were relatively less developed than them. They showed up with superior technology, so maybe that might have been easier to conquer than if they were to go invade Germany, as Napoleon did. Or at least they might have had an upper hand, but in terms of difficulty of getting there as well, it might have even been more difficult. So nonetheless, there's just caveats that 1% is not the same as 1% somewhere else. Also, many of our nomadic empires ruled over massive areas of lands, but largely unpopulated. So the capital, however, unique among many of our empires, where the capitals have moved, it was always Paris. One could say that Versailles maybe was outside of Paris, which might have been at least the capital under Louis XIV, but nonetheless, Paris has always been generally seen as the capital. The government was an absolute monarchy under the first colonial empire, and a monarchy as well as a republic or imperial, such as Napoleon III under the second French colonial empire. The official languages were, that should be French. That was not updated for the last slide. My apologies. French. Religion, but I think one can certainly guess that. Religion was Catholicism, Islam, Judaism, Louisiana Voodoo, Haitian Voodoo, Vodou, Buddhism, and Hinduism. And population was several to over 100 million. As for the images, we have in the top left the very famous portrait of Louis XIV, painted in 1701. Very, very famous, I think, and one of the most identifiable portraits of all time. To the right of that, the left banner, we have the Royal Standard of France before 1792, manifesting the Petit Fleur de Lis in gold as well, and the importance of the color blue, but the crown itself has red, so there's sort of red, white, and blue has always sort of been a manifested colors of France. To the right of that, we have the flag of the French Empire and the French Republic, which is I believe, identical to the modern French flag, at least. Maybe. Yes, it is identical, at least as far as I can see, but maybe I should confirm that. There might be a slight difference in color. To the right of that, we have the French North America, was known as Nouvelle France, in New France. So there's an image of Quebec in, I believe that would be Quebec City, and I would recommend zooming in. It's a beautiful piece of art, but also just showing this sort of influence that the French colonial empire had even on modern states today, such as Quebec. To the right of that, we have an image of the British attack on the French-controlled island of Gorée off the coast of Senegal during the 7 Years' War in 1758. So a very, very important period during the first French colonial empire, but also showing the significance of the navy, which was, for example, Louis XIV really focused on for developing the empire. To the right of that, we have Le Petit Journal, which was a publication during the French occupation of Taza in May of 1914, so one of the latter of its colonial ambitions. Taza is in modern-day Morocco. And to the right of that, in the bottom right, we have the British invasion of Martinique in 1809, marking one of the periods of downfall for the French colonial empire, the second period particularly. As for additional history, we have the Cartier claim Gaspé Bay in 1534, marking one of the earliest achievements or accomplishments in its colonial ambitions. The sale of Louisiana was in 1803, marking one of its periods of decline, at least of the first colonial empire. The conquest of Algeria was marking sort of the full period from 1830 to 1903 was when it started to seek independence. The French Union was in 1946, marking the period of de-imperialization, and the French community was formed in 1958, a further period of decolonization, and the independence of Vanuatu was one of the sort of last colonies to seek independence in 1980, formally marking the end of our French colonial empire. So that is Louis XIV and the French colonial empire, and we'll discuss later more in the comparison and their respective empire. So the rise and fall of the Oyo Empire, so quite a different empire, but very, very unique as well. So the Oyo Empire was a Yoruba empire in West Africa. It was located in present-day southern Benin and western Nigeria, including the southwest zone and the western half of the north-central zone of Nigeria. The empire grew to become the largest Yoruba-speaking state through the organizational and administrative efforts of the Yoruba people, trade, as well as the military use of cavalry, so a militaristic advantage, the usage of cavalry, as we shall see. The Oyo Empire was one of the most politically important states in Western Africa from the mid-17th to the late 18th centuries, and held sway not only over most of the other kingdoms of Yoruba land, but also over nearby African states, notably the Fawn Kingdom of Dahomey in the modern Republic of Benin in the west. So not only ruling over most of the Yoruba kingdoms, but also having sway over nearby kingdoms as well. So quite a significant power in this region, or the most significant during its time. As for the early beginnings and formations of this rise period, from the 14th to the 16th centuries, so the Oyo Empire was one of the most powerful and influential kingdoms, or African kingdoms, and was established by the Yoruba people in present-day southwestern Nigeria. The origins of the Oyo Empire can be traced back to the early 14th century. As for the founding myths and the early kings, so the Oyo Empire's origins are linked to Oranmiyan, a legendary prince from Ile-Ife, considered to be the cradle of Yoruba civilization. Also very, very, just a beautiful myth that goes along with this, the cradle of civilization in Western Africa, maybe even perhaps the cradle of civilization more broadly. That's just a hypothesis I am throwing out there, but there is no evidence to suggest that I've been provided with. Oranmiyan is believed to have been founded Oyo after a series of conquests. So he founded this group of people after a series of conquests, so a conquering figure. As for the early rulers of Oyo, known as the Alaafins, who are named for a king, for example, we'll highlight Alaafin Abiodun, consolidated power by unifying smaller Yoruba states and establishing a centralized authority. So even as we saw with the French colonial empire, centralization is a common necessity to form empires. As for geographic and strategic advantages, it was located in the savanna region north of the tropical forests. Oyo was strategically positioned for trade and military expeditions, so its geography maybe allowed it to outperform its peers in terms of trade and military. Its location facilitated trade with North African states through the Trans-Saharan trade route. So having the Sahara is a difficult region to cross because you have to be really on the route, otherwise you might starve or run out of water. Furthermore, as for expansion and consolidation period from the 16th to the 18th centuries, so the Oyo Empire experienced significant expansion and consolidation during the 16th and 18th centuries, becoming a dominant force in West Africa. As for its military prowess and cavalry, the Oyo army was known for its powerful cavalry, which gave it a decisive advantage in warfare. So, as we saw with many of our nomadic empires that were allowed to, if one has cavalry and the other doesn't, it's really quite a significant advantage. Therefore, the use of horses acquired through trade with the northern states, so therefore having that access to the north and south, or being that bridge state through the north and the south, allowed them to have the access to the cavalry and use it against the south, perhaps. Enabled them to expand its territory and influence. As for key conquests and expansion, so under Alaafin Abiodun, who reigned from around circa 1560 to 1580, Oyo expanded its territories by conquering neighboring states, so really expansionist, we even call expansionist policy, which is sort of a manifested a spirit of an empire necessarily. The empire reached its zenith under Alaafin Abiodun, who reigned from circa 1650 to 1680, so the zenith, who further expanded Oyo's territory, subduing the Nupe and Dahomey kingdoms and extending influence over the Yoruba hinterlands. But by being at the zenith, necessarily things start to decline after this. But first to note on its administrative structure. So Oyo developed a sophisticated administrative system to manage its vast territories. The empire was divided into provinces governed by local chiefs known as Obas, who reported to the Alaafin, who was the king, as mentioned. The capital Oyo Ile was a political and economic hub as well, featuring a royal palace, marketplaces, and defensive structures, so sedentary, but also having usage of cavalry, so twofold powerful, by being able to build defensive structures and having usage of cavalry. As for political and religious institutions, the Oyo Messi, a council of 7 high-ranking officials, played a crucial role in governance, advising the Alaafin and ensuring checks and balances. So there's not only just the king or the Alaafin ruling, but also the Messi, council of 7 high-ranking officials also ruling over this region. As for the Ogboni Society, a secretive religious judicial institution, also influenced political decision-making and maintained social order. So almost having 3 groups. They have the executive, the king, they have the Messi, who are the council, so we could think of them as the legislators, and this sort of religious judicial sector, so pretty actually perhaps well-formed structure of checks and balances. But also the king maybe had relatively more or less power than other kings. It's difficult to say, but nonetheless, they were certainly held the executive power. But it's difficult. There's no evidence of also clashes between the religious judicial sect or the Messi or the king, and so it's hard to say which one was the most powerful. But we might assume that it would be the king. As for agriculture during this period, the fertile lands of Oyo supported a cultivation of crops such as yams, maize, and millet, which sustained the population and generated a surplus for trade. As for trade and commerce, Oyo's strategic location facilitated trade with various regions, including the coastal areas, northern states, and European merchants. So also having access to the coast was a significant advantage as well, bringing them access to colonial empires as well. As for trade and commerce, Oyo's strategic location facilitated trade with various regions, once again, coastal areas, northern states, and European merchants. The empire traded goods such as cola nuts, ivory, slaves, and locally produced crafts, receiving horses, firearms, and luxury items in return. So, going out, cola nuts, ivory, slaves, and crafts, and taking in firearms, which gave them a militaristic advantage, and luxury items, which maybe doesn't necessarily give an advantage. So as for art and culture, and maybe that was one of the declines of both empires, was buying external luxury, which doesn't necessarily give a militaristic advantage, but it might inspire the people, at least. So as for art and culture, the Oyo Empire was renowned for its artistic achievements, particularly in bronze and ivory sculpture, textiles, and headwork. The Yoruba religion as well and culture flourished with elaborate ceremonies, festivals, and the worship of deities known as the Orishas, forming a part of the integral part of daily life. So by having a religious institution, it is in some ways a form of centralization, or at least creating a commonality between peoples. But nonetheless came the decline and fall in the 19th century. The decline of the Oyo Empire began in the late 18th century and accelerated to the 19th century due to internal strife and external pressures and changing trade dynamics. As starting with the internal conflicts and civil wars, succession disputes and power struggles among the ruling elites weakened the central authority. Furthermore, factionalism within the Oyo Messi, which was their legislative body, or at least their governors, or their most powerful citizens, and challenges of the Alaafin power led to instability. Therefore, the decline of effective leadership and administrative control contributed to internal fragmentation. Furthermore, there was rebellion and revolt. So subjugated states and provinces began to revolt against Oyo's control. Notably, the kingdoms of Dahomey, previously a vassal state, successfully rebelled and gained independence. As for internal revolts and external threats, further eroded Oyo's dominance. Furthermore, economic challenges came at this time further, so many prongs leading to its decline. Not necessarily one more significant than the other, but maybe if we would put finger on one, it would be the internal rebellions, and maybe also the internal battles amongst the nobility. But nonetheless, economic challenges were significant too. The Atlantic slave trade, which had been a significant source of wealth, began to decline in the 19th century due to increasing European abolition movements. So perhaps because of the decline of if the slave trade maintained, maybe they would have continued. So maybe for better, for at least for worse, morally perhaps. As for shifts in trade routes, as in that slavery was bad and they were reliant on slaves. Shifts in trade routes and economic disruptions weakened Oyo's economic base. As the Fulani Jihad and invasions. So the Fulani Jihad, a series of Islamic holy wars led by Usman Dan Fodio, swept through northern Nigeria in the early 19th century as well. The jihadists captured Oyo territories, including Ilorin, which became a center of resistance for Oyo rule against Oyo rule. So they captured a region within them. So this jihadist movement came and captured a key territory, Ilorin, and became a significant threat to Oyo rule. Further, the Fulani invasions and subsequent conflicts further destabilized the empire. Further, to collapse of central authority, so the cumulative effect of the internal conflicts, external invasions, and economic decline led to the collapse of the central authority of the Oyo Empire. By the mid-19th century, the once mighty Oyo Empire had disintegrated into smaller autonomous states. So nonetheless, the legacy, despite its decline, the Oyo Empire left a lasting legacy in the history and culture of the Yoruba people and West Africa. For its cultural influence, the Oyo's culture and religious traditions continue to influence Yoruba society to this day. The political structures and systems of governance developed during the Oyo Empire set a precedent for the later Yoruba states, so still having those multi-pronged forms of governments, which necessarily they did not invent either, but nonetheless they continued to the successor states, at least in many ways, their structures of government. The artistic heritage of the Oyo Empire, particularly in sculpture and textile production, remains celebrated and preserved till this day as well. As for political impact, the administrative and military strategies of Oyo served as models for subsequent African states and kingdoms. The memory of Oyo's power and influence persists in the collective consciousness of the Yoruba people, symbolizing a period of both unity and strength. So a period that is thought fondly of by many of the descendants or successors of the Oyo Empire, and even the broader community. Thus, the rise and fall of the Oyo Empire encapsulate a significant chapter in African history, marked by military prowess, economic prosperity, cultural richness, and political complexity. From its early beginnings to its eventual decline, the Oyo Empire played a pivotal role in shaping the history and identity of the Yoruba people and the broader West African region. So very, very important empire, a fascinating and unique empire, in my opinion, to cover. And we've started to cover a decent amount of African empires during this period and leading up to this period. So I think it's really starting to connect, and I hope you've followed some of the other episodes that particularly cover the African regions, particularly the West African regions. So as to highlight a specific leader, we have Alaafin Abiodun, or King Abiodun, perhaps considered by some the most important ruler of the Oyo Empire. So Abiodun, who reigned from circa, which means approximately 1770 to 1789 CE, was an 18th century Alaafin, or king of the Oyo people in what is now modern-day Nigeria and Benin. As for his early life and ascension to the throne, Alaafin Abiodun was one of the most significant and influential rulers of the Oyo Empire and was born in the early 18th century. The exact date of his birth, however, remains uncertain, but his reign is well documented. He ascended to the throne in 1770 CE during a period of significant internal and external challenges for the empire. It seems to be a common theme that many of our most powerful empires do come during internal challenges, but maybe it's just because they're contrasts that maybe the norm is internal challenges and they are sort of the antidotes. As for his lineage and background, Abiodun was a member of the ruling royal family of Oyo, the descendants of the Oramiyan. So they believe from this myth story that the Oyo people, or this Oyo family, came directly from this god, the legendary founder of the empire, or the cradle of civilization. His early life was marked by a traditional grooming and training typical for princes destined for leadership. So, unlike some of our emperors who came to power through unlikely circumstances, those who are certain to get the throne usually are given what they believe to be the best education, or an education designed for a king. As for political climate, Abiodun ascended to the throne following a period of instability and conflict, both within the royal court and among the provinces of the empire. His rise to power involved navigating the complex dynamics of the Oyo political landscape, which included influential council members and regional leaders, known as those Messi, or the council members. As for his reign and administration, Alaafin Abiodun's reign marked a period of relative stability and prosperity for the Oyo Empire. His leadership was characterized by efforts to centralize authority, very characteristic of effective, or at least effective in expanding their empire leaders, centralize authority, manage internal conflicts, and expand economic activities, given their significant advantage in that area. Starting with his centralization of power, Abiodun worked diligently to centralize authority, reducing the power of regional chiefs and influential Oyo Messi Council. He aimed to strengthen the role of the Alaafin and ensure loyalty to the central government was paramount. So, therefore, sort of, in some ways, taking power from the nobility to strengthen himself. But nonetheless, keep them having power, but nonetheless sort of make them more loyal to him rather than sort of deal between themselves, as make them perhaps in some ways more dependent on him as well. As for his military campaigns, Abiodun led several military campaigns to suppress rebellions and expand Oyo's territories. Notably, he successfully quelled the revolt of provincial governors who sought greater autonomy, so putting down those revolts from these Messi particularly, reaffirming the dominance and central authority of the king, or the Alaafin. As for his economic policies, his reign saw a focus of enhancing the economic prosperity of the empire. Abiodun encouraged trade, particularly with the European merchants across the coast. The trade in goods such as ivory, gold, and slaves brought significant wealth to Oyo, where the decline of slaves ultimately manifested in part to the decline of the empire itself. Abiodun also promoted agricultural activity and productivity, so getting more per acre, ensuring the empire's food security and ability to sustain a growing population. So therefore, it's important for supporting trade and military, a larger population, through increasing productivity of the land. As for cultural and religious patronage, Abiodun was a patron of Yoruba culture and religion. He supported traditional festivals, ceremonies, and the arts, which flourished during his reign. His court became a central of cultural activity, attracting artisans, musicians, and religious leaders from not only within the region but from other neighboring states as well, and those they came to conquer. The Alaafin also maintained religious institutions and practices that were integral to Yoruba identity, ensuring that the spiritual and cultural heritage of the empire was preserved. So by strengthening the religion, which was necessarily linked to his claim to the throne, it was certainly here a form of centralization, if not also forming a common identity. As for challenges and conflicts, despite his successes, Alaafin Abiodun's reign was not without challenges. He faced significant opposition from within and external threats that tested his leadership. Starting with internal dissent, one of the major internal conflicts during Abiodun's reign was with his powerful chief minister, Basoran Gaha, Gaha wielded considerable influence at times and posed a direct challenge to Abiodun's authority. So his chief minister was had posed a significant internal threat to his throne, but nonetheless he was able to succumb it. Abiodun's efforts to curb the power of Basoran led to a series of political intrigue and conflicts. Eventually, he was able, however, to outmaneuver Gaha and reassert his control. So maybe whereas his predecessors and successors were not able to defeat their opponents, such as Gaha or their equivalents to Gaha, he was able to overcome his chief minister. But this struggle highlighted the fragile nature of the centralized power of the Oyo. As for significant external threats, the Oyo Empire faced threats from neighboring states and European colonial powers seeking to expand their influence in West Africa. Abiodun's diplomatic and military strategies were crucial in maintaining Oyo's sovereignty and military integrity. As for his legacy and impact, Alaafin Abiodun's reign left a lasting legacy on the Oyo Empire and the Yoruba people. His leadership contributed to a period of consolidation and cultural flourishing that is remembered as one of the high points of Oyo history, and perhaps the broader Nigerian or history, as well as one of its key or one of its high points throughout its history, and also a very, very fascinating cultural myth, at least for those who claim descendancy from this region. Nigeria is a very massive country and includes many different regions, and Benin is also quite distinct as well. But nonetheless, a very high point, at least for those who are connected in lineage to these peoples. As for political legacy, Abiodun's efforts to centralize power and strengthen the role of Alaafin set precedents for future rulers. His administrative reforms and military successors reinforced the stability of the empire, albeit temporarily. As for his economic and cultural flourishing, the economic prosperity and cultural patronage of Abiodun's reign enriched the empire and left a rich and lasting legacy on Yoruba art, music, and religious practices. The period is often celebrated for its contributions to the cultural heritage of the Yoruba people. So very much, as we shall see, like Louis XIV, forming a cultural identity. But nonetheless, it is marked by his challenges to authority. So despite his achievements, the conflicts and challenges Abiodun faced during his reign also highlighted the inherent difficulties in maintaining a centralized, cohesive empire in the face of internal and external pressures. So thus, Alaafin Abiodun stands out as one of the most important rulers in the history of the Oyo Empire. His reign was marked by significant achievements in centralizing power, expanding economic activities, and promoting cultural heritage. However, his tenure also underscored the challenges of leadership in a complex and dynamic Yoruba history as a period of strength, and also a period of strength and prosperity and cultural richness of the Oyo Empire. So, in my opinion, a very, very fascinating empire and leader. So to highlight the content of the slide, and very unique region as well. So to make our list of largest empires. So, as for the content of the slide, we have Alaafin Abiodun, which means King Abiodun, and the Oyo Empire. It was the largest Yoruba-speaking empire through organizational and administrative efforts, trade, and military use of cavalry. And also, I might add, access to the ocean as well, the Bight of Benin. One of the most politically important states in West Africa from the mid-17th to the late 18th century, holding sway over most of Yoruba land kingdoms and the Bon Kingdom of Dahomey, so one of the most important empires during this time and region. The first significant leader we highlighted was Alaafin Abiodun. The empire was the Oyo Empire. The period was from circa 1300 to 1896 CE, considered the early modern and pre-colonial Africa periods. The modern locations include Nigeria and Benin. Million square kilometers is 0.15. Equivalent in million square kilometers would be 0.06%. Of the world, it would be 0.11%. So maybe a little bit smaller than in comparison to the largest empires we covered. The average is 1.14, but nonetheless, it's still on the list of largest empires. And for the region, it's it's certainly one of the largest to cover this particular region. It's one of its most significant in West Africa, and also it was a difficult region to rule over. It's been populated for a very, very long time and had warring states for thousands and thousands of years. So to culminate 0.15 million square kilometers after a rich history of military, and it's really a significant achievement, and perhaps in large part fueled by its usage of cavalry. Its capital was Oyoil. That should be a hyphen, not a zero, but Oyoil from 1300 to 1535, and Oyo Boho from 1600 onwards to its decline. Its government was an elective monarchy, so quite unique, but it seemed to still come from this royal lineage of the Oyo people, but it was still in some ways elective. The common languages was Yoruba. The religion was the Yoruba religion, Islam, and Christianity. Population was several hundreds of thousands to a few millions. So in the images, there was no images of Alaafin Abiodun, so we have a beautiful image of an elephant with tusks. So an elephant, or the Janku, was the totem of the kings and emperors of the Oyo prior to Abiodun. So up until him, that was the symbol. So it's quite majestic, and I don't think there are many animals more worthy of representing a king. So to the right of that, we have the Veve of Ogun, or Vive of Ogun, which was a war god of Yoruba, and the totem of both emperors and kings that have followed Abiodun, and the various members of the Basharan chieftaincy family that have served the state throughout history. So this royal symbol. And it's really quite fascinating to really, if you can zoom in or see it, to study it. I think there's a lot of signification that I cannot even grasp. To the right of that, we have an Oyo Empire during the 17th to the 18th century. So as you can see, on horseback, manifesting the importance of cavalry for the rise of this empire and in slowing its fall. To the right of that, we have the Solomon knot, which is a quasi-heraldic symbol of the Yoruba royalty. Below that, we have the Igbo Onigun Marin, which was a quadrangle of Solomon's knot. So these very sort of infinite-like shapes are very symbolic of this empire. And maybe we can cross-reference that to the symbol of the empire as well, the Vivi or the Vev. And below that, we have a reconstruction of the palace of the Alaafin of Oyo in the circa mid-1900s, and colorized. It's still quite an old photograph and still quite an old reconstruction, but nonetheless, not exactly as they had it, but still recolorized, and we get a picture of what the throne might have looked like. And still we can have some of the people who are the descendants of the Oyo Empire. To the right of that, we have another map showing the broader region of Africa, seen as it crosses into both Nigeria and Benin, for example. As for the motto was, I'm not going to try to read that, I think I'll just embarrass myself, but it means Yoruba for Oyo, descendants of the Alaafin. It was preceded by the Ife Empire, and it was succeeded by the Iloran Emirate and the Ibadan. And the legislature was the Oyo Messi, as I mentioned, the legislature, and the Ogboni. And as to the top right, we have a more detailed map showing us the Oyo is here, Benin is here, Nupe is here, Ketu, and Borgu. So the Borgu, I guess, Bazin, and the Bight of Benin. So, but nonetheless, they have access to water on both sides and sort of have control over this trade route, which gave them great economic prosperity. Not only have access to cavalry. So that is, in my opinion, the fascinating Oyo Empire and Alaafin Abiodun. So to compare and contrast Louis XIV, King Louis XIV, or Roi Louis XIV of the French colonial empire, and Alaafin Abiodun of the Oyo Empire, starting with their background and rise to power. So Louis XIV of France, his early and early life. So Louis XIV was born on September 5th, 1638 in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, and he was the son of Louis XIII and Anne of Austria. He became king at the age of 4 after his father's death, with his mother as serving as regent and Cardinal Mazarin as chief minister. As for his ascension to the throne, Louis XIV officially began his personal rule in 1661 after the death of Mazarin, declaring his intent to govern without a chief minister. His rise to power was marked by consolidation of authority and establishment of absolute monarchy. As for Alaafin Abiodun, his birth and early life, Abiodun was born in the early 18th century into the royal family of Oyo Empire, so both into the royal family. Details about his early life are less documented compared to Louis XIV, but he was groomed for leadership from a young age. So both of them were groomed for leadership from a young age, but Louis XIV was necessarily king by the age of 4. As for Alaafin Abiodun's ascension to the throne, Abiodun became Alaafin around 1770 during a period of instability. So there was instability that Louis XIV observed that Mazarin was dealing with in his mother as regent, and therefore inspired him to become powerful. But nonetheless, Abiodun came into a period of internal strife as well. His rise involved navigating complex power dynamics within the Oyo court and reasserting central authority. So both of them engaged in central authority, perhaps through seeing at young ages internal strife. But both of them, unlike maybe some of our other, maybe a minority of our other emperors or leaders of empires, they did come from the royal family and were most likely to rule. And they did receive the best education, or the education the people thought fitting of a king, not, for example, that of for the religious classes or the judicial classes or the working classes. As for their reigns and administration, starting with Louis XIV, centralization of power, Louis XIV centralized power by reducing the influence of the nobility and parliaments. He moved the court to the Palace of Versailles as well, where he could keep a nobility under close watch. As for his administrative reforms, he implemented reforms to strengthen the royal administration, including the establishment of intendants to enforce royal policies from across France. As for his economic policies, his finance minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert promoted mercantilism, fostering economic self-sufficiency and colonial expansion to increase wealth. As for Alaafin Abiodun, his centralization of power, Abiodun also focused on centralizing authority, reducing the power of provincial chiefs and the Oyo Messi Council. He worked to strengthen the position of the Alaafin against internal dissent, so both of them very much focused on centralizing their authority. Alaafin Abiodun, however, did not necessarily move the court. But maybe he did, but I have not seen that documented. At least the capital remained the same, but the capital also remained the same, Paris, under Louis XIV, but nonetheless the court was moved to Versailles. As for their Abiodun's administrative structure, Abiodun maintained a traditional administrative structure relying on local chiefs and the Oyo administrative structure to assert control over them. As for his economic policies, Abiodun encouraged trade with the European merchants, focusing on the exchange of goods such as ivory, gold, and slaves. He also promoted agricultural productivity to support the empire's economy. So maybe in productivity gains, Abiodun might more noted there, but they were both very focused on trade. But maybe Louis XIV was less focused on trade than more colonial expansion. As for military and expansion, so starting with Louis XIV, military campaigns. So Louis XIV pursued numerous military campaigns to expand French territories and influence. His reign saw the War of Devolution, the Franco-Dutch War, and the War of Spanish Succession, among others. As for colonial expansion, under his rule, France expanded its colonial empire, establishing territories in North America, the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia. As for Abiodun, his military campaigns, Abiodun led military campaigns to suppress internal rebellions and expand Oyo's territories. He successfully quelled the revolt and reasserted control over vassal states. So both of them had the dual-pronged, maintaining their vassal states, but also simultaneously expanded it. In terms of absolute numbers, perhaps Louis XIV expanded more, but Abiodun started with a smaller territory to begin with. So in terms of relative terms, maybe Louis XIV might still be greater, but nonetheless, he began with more too. As for territorial control, the Oyo's expansion under Abiodun focused on consolidating control over neighboring Yoruba states and maintaining influence in the region rather than overseas colonization. As for colonial cultural patronage, Louis XIV's patronage of the art, Louis XIV was a great patron of the arts, fostering a cultural renaissance in France. His support extended to architecture, music, theater, and literature, with notable contributions to the Baroque style. So Baroque is a very significant period of art, literature, and culture that was really much enhanced under Louis XIV. Furthermore, Versailles, the Palace of Versailles became a symbol of his power and the central of cultural activity, showcasing the opulence and power of the monarchy. As for Abiodun, his cultural and religious patronage, Abiodun supported the Yoruba cultural and religious traditions, including festivals, ceremonies, and the arts. His reign saw a flourishing of the Yoruba art, music, and religious practice as well, so both of them very much influencing the culture of their region, and that region, the culture that still exists in part and to a large extent in certain areas to this day. As for cultural and religious patronage, Abiodun supported the Yoruba cultural and religious traditions as well, including festivals, ceremonies, and the arts of both of them. But maybe Abiodun might have been focused a little bit more on religion, but both of them were connected or seen. Louis XIV was Dieudonné, so both of them were very much religiously inclined. So the royal court under Abiodun was a hub of cultural and religious activity, reflecting the rich heritage of the Yoruba people. As for their challenges and conflicts under Louis XIV, it started with internal opposition. So Louis faced opposition from various factions within France, including the nobility and the parliaments. His efforts to centralize power led to conflicts, but he managed to maintain control. As for his external conflicts, his numerous wars strained France's resources and led to significant debt. The War of the Spanish Succession in particular was costly and ended with mixed results. As for Abiodun, starting with his internal conflicts, Abiodun dealt with significant internal dissent, including challenges from the powerful figures such as Bassirane Gaha. So Gaha may be seen as, for example, Louis XIV's Mazarin. So both of them sort of had this leader figure, or their first minister, but nonetheless Mazarin died, and then Louis sort of came to his control, whereas Abiodun directly had to oppose Gaha and did so successfully. So both of them sort of overcame their chief minister in different ways. As for external threats for Oyo, the Oyo Empire faced threats from neighboring states and European colonial powers. Abiodun's leadership was crucial in navigating these external pressures. As for legacy, Louis XIV's cultural impact, Louis XIV left a lasting cultural legacy with his patronage of the arts and architecture, setting high standards for French culture. Versailles remains a symbol of his reign and the height of French absolutism. As for his political legacy, his reign reinforced the principles of absolute monarchy, influencing the future European rulers and shaping French history. As for Abiodun, his cultural influence, Abiodun's reign is remembered for its contributions to Yoruba, or manifestations of Yoruba culture and traditions. His support for arts and religion enriched the cultural heritage of the Oyo Empire. As for his political legacy, the Abiodun's efforts to centralize power and maintain stability left a significant impact on the governance of the Oyo Empire, though the empire eventually faced decline after his reign. So thus, Louis XIV and Alaafin Abiodun were both pivotal rulers who shaped the destinies of their respective empires through centralization of power, military campaigns, and cultural patronage, while Louis XIV expanded influence globally through colonialism and left a profound cultural legacy in Europe. Abiodun strengthened the Oyo Empire's regional dominance and enriched Yoruba culture, more on land. Both leaders faced significant challenges, for example, but different ways from their first ministers, including internal dissent as well, and external threats as well, perhaps through their own ambitions, but also through the natural external pressures. And their legacies continue to influence their nations' respective histories to this day. So that, in my opinion, is the fascinating French colonial empires, first and second, and Louis XIV, and Alaafin Abiodun of the Oyo Empire. My name is Kalen Ashcroft. This is Cashcroft TV. I'd be very grateful if you continue to support. Thank you very much.